I'm asking you to introduce yourself, Robin. I'm Agnes Callard. I teach here in the philosophy department. Thank you. I've been on leave this year, but I've still been running Night Owls. But next year I'll be back in full force. What else do I want to say? There's nothing to announce because it's the last event of the year. Robin, do you want to tell them who you are?
Hello, this is my second Night Owls. We did one a year or so ago on the sacred.
Actually, does Robin's mic sound weird?
Does it? Hello?
No? Okay, it sounds weird to me. Wait, I want to say something. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, Robin. Okay, in the fall, maybe some of you guys were here for the Ross Douthat event. So after the event, Ross and I had like a little debrief and how did I think it went? And he's like, what's your best event that you ever did? And I was like, it was Robin 2 years ago. And so that's why he's back. Okay.
Hello, I'm an economics professor at George Mason. I have a podcast with Agnes. We have 4 seasons now worth of issues. I once did physics, engineering, computer science for 9 years, came back to get my PhD and economics and political science. And since I've gotten tenure almost 20 years ago, I don't stay in my lane. So you'll see that tonight. I like to think of a lot of different things and I try to figure out what's important, and what I think we're going to talk about tonight, I think is important.
Okay, also tell them about how you were once a student here.
I was. So from 1981 to 84, I was a grad student here. I started out in the Conceptual Foundations of Science as a philosophy of science program. I switched to physics, so I got 2 masters in those 2 subjects. I met my wife here in Burton Judson in 81, and we started living together in 82. And then she followed me out to Silicon Valley, and then we got married, and we now have 2 kids who are now grown, and 31 and 33.
Okay, all right, Robin, in your essay, Beware Cultural Drift, you write, today is no typical day in history. Explain what you meant by that.
Cultural evolution is humanity's superpower. It is what makes us able to learn things so much faster than all the other animals and do so many more things than other animals do. Up until a few centuries ago, the world had hundreds of thousands of little cultures. Every peasant group of a few thousand people was in essence a different culture. They were poor, there were often pandemics and invading armies. They were near the edge of survival. So if a culture went wrong by adopting unproductive, maladaptive practices, it died out fast. So cultural evolution is kind of like a race car compared to an ordinary car. It's very powerful and fast, but it breaks a lot. Cultural evolution isn't that reliable, but that was okay because when a local culture would break, it would just get replaced by its neighbors because these hundreds of thousands of cultures were just near the edge of survival. Then in the last few centuries, we've done 2 big things. One is we formed nation states where individual peasant cultures were merged into national cultures, which national identity and then integrated national markets and national languages, etc. And then in the last century, we've created a world culture, especially among elites, where the same sort of people trained in the same sort of places like this sit in top organizations all around the world and work comfortably together because they share a world culture. This has vastly reduced the number of cultures in the world. And the question is, are there enough cultures now for cultural evolution to work? Cultural evolution requires that there be variation and selection. And do we have enough variation and do we have enough selection? Because the few cultures we have around the world, they aren't dying. They aren't starving to death or being taken over by neighbors. They are just persisting.
It seems like a good thing, but...
Yes, you might think so. And we don't have that much variation. And then the key last thing to notice is they change a lot fast, which you might not expect. You might have thought cultures are just tradition, and tradition doesn't change. But in fact, in our society, our culture is changing rapidly, and most cultures around the world seem to be changing rapidly. And then the question is, how adaptive are these changes in culture, especially ours? Well, at least that's one question.
There's seats in the front, right here. You want to come sit in the front? Best seats in the house.
We'd be honored to have you. So that's my quick summary. We should worry about how adaptive the changes we're having in culture, because if they're not adaptive, then basically cultural evolution has now gone off the rails.
Okay.
Culture's changing, but selection isn't disciplining it, and it would just be going wrong.
Good. And so I take it that one of your central data points in arguing that we are going off the rails and there's maladaptive selection is fertility decline. So I want to actually poll the audience about something. So you probably know that fertility has been declining over the past few hundred years. We reached peak births, like the highest number of babies born in 2016. And in a few decades, we're going to reach peak population, after which population in the world is going to start to decline. The richer nations of the world are all below replacement fertility. Some of them, like South Korea, is at a really low, like 0.7 children per woman. And it seems reasonable to project, and you can speak to this some more, Robin, that poorer nations will, as they get richer, also experience fertility drops. So here's a question that I want to ask the audience. How many people think that this is a problem? That is, that the decline of fertility is a problem? Raise your hand if you think fertility decline is a problem. It's a bad thing. Okay, hold on. I'm going to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. I'm not going to count the maybes. Okay, 25. Okay, and how many people think it's not a problem? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. Okay, my counting wasn't very good, and I think I missed some people there. So the "it's not a problem" is winning out in this room, Robin. Just to know what you're up against.
Right.
Okay.
There's a field of study of cultural evolution which analyzes how cultures change and what processes cause them to change and what the result of that is. It's built largely on tools of biological evolution, but the processes are somewhat different. And in both of these literatures, the primary unit of analysis is adaptation.
Pause 1 second, Robin. Hey guys, there's a spot right up here up front. There's another one there. There's another one there. So there are spots. You just have to keep looking. Yeah, go ahead.
So in these literatures, what they're asking is which features will grow and come to be common in populations, and which features will go away and disappear and become extinct. So an analysis of cultural evolution that says that some cultural features are maladaptive predicts that those features will go away. So I think it's pretty universally accepted that communities whose populations decline, i.e., and not in times of famine or bad times, just in good times the population decline, that's a pretty strong sign of maladaptation in the sense that those will go away. They are predicted to go away because they don't replace themselves. So then the issue here is that if we have below replacement fertility and that continues, which it does seem plausible, then our descendants, our civilization declines and fades and then is plausibly replaced by other civilizations which don't have below replacement fertility. So it's about the existence of your descendants and what they're like. So, obviously, if you thought you might die tomorrow, that would probably get your attention. You might want to prevent that. If you thought you were going to pass on some terrible disease to your children who would then die at the age of 12, you would also think that's bad. Then I guess it's a matter of just how far into the future do you care about? How much do you want the things that we are and the things that we value to last into the future, or is it okay if they go away? And just to be clear, the most likely way they would go away is they'd be replaced by some other non-declining fertility. We actually have some examples of that. That is, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Haredi are cultures that at the moment have been doubling every 20 years for over a century, at least the Amish, and they're on track to just keep doubling every 20 years, and in 200 years that's a factor of 1,000. And so in a few centuries, they would come to dominate the rest of the population of the world that's declining. Now, that's just the prediction of maladaptation in evolutionary terms. Now it's up to you to decide if you care.
I just want to ask a clarificatory question about maladaptive. So, like, at first the way you defined it was it's a feature that tends to go away. But, so like bell-bottom genes or something. Is that maladaptive because it didn't last, or then it's not when it comes back? Or is it something like a feature which, when the group adopts that feature, the group tends to go away?
Right, we're talking about cultures disappearing.
Okay.
And their members disappearing, and i.e. not having so many descendants. And not having descendants who share their culture.
Okay. And so, for instance, if we disappeared, but like the Amish take over the world, but then eventually they fragment, and then they discover our writings, and then they like take on our views, like we did with like the ancient Greeks and Romans a little bit, then would that mean our culture was maladaptive or adaptive?
It would mean that we didn't lose everything, but we have an inheritance, and we will pass on some of what we are, not all of what we are. And the question is, how much did you want to pass on? I guess you could ask, if you were in the Roman Empire in year 0, and you could foresee that the Roman Empire would decline, and you liked the Roman Empire, would you want to do something to slow the decline, prevent the decline, or maybe make sure that the things you most treasured about it would last and passed on? Because basically what happened is a very small group of people at 0, maybe 1,000 Christians, they doubled every 20 years over 3 centuries, and that was enough over 3 centuries to take over the Roman Empire and replace them. They liked some things about the Roman Empire, but not others. They threw a lot of Roman things away because they didn't like a lot of Roman things. And that's how the Roman Empire declined and fell and lost some of what it was.
So like a lot of the stuff we have, I mean, like it seems like the world would be like make really fireproof libraries, or put some of our writings like in holes in the ground, things like that. Like that is, if you think, it's not that likely that our culture, that like our descendants are going to survive for thousands of years, but the stuff that the cultural products are more likely to. So if we care about the preservation of our culture, we should worry less about fertility and more about like the preservation of artifacts.
Well, it's not enough just to store stuff in the ground. You'll need people to want to dig it up and want to do something with it.
Yeah, I mean, you also need to hide it a little bit, right? Because the people who don't like our culture in the more immediate future might want to destroy it. So you might want to hide it in like a lot of places. I don't know, that seems like how I would start thinking if I want to think about like long-term survival of philosophy. I might want to like preserve some texts. Well, let me ask you a question. We might come back to this. You've written about corporate cultures. And so you've said that these analogous points sort of hold for corporate cultures, which is that, there is innovation within a particular firm, and then there's just the proliferation of firms in the market, and there's the evolution, which is that the firms that don't work well, which, for you're saying a lot of the value of a firm comes in the corporate culture. The firms that don't work well die out, and that's how we get evolution of corporate culture. Would this be an argument against like big business and big corporation, and in favor of smaller economic units, like against Google or whatever, because those things are more inclined to waver in the way that to drift in the way that a big nation state will, by contrast with like a smaller financial organization?
Yes, basically. But just to be clear to everyone, we know a fair bit about macro cultures, the sort of culture of the United States, etc., but we know a lot more about corporate cultures, so that's a nice place to get your bearings in thinking about culture. To understand how culture works and sort of the key features of culture is to look at corporate cultures. There's 166,000 firms in the United States with at least 100 employees, so there are just a lot of corporate cultures. And so what we know is that the tangible capital in firms, like their buildings and machines and stuff like that, that's only a tiny fraction of their value. Most of the value in corporations is in the culture, and corporate cultures change fast. And this is one of the biggest things most managers have to deal with, is how to understand their culture, try to manage it, and prevent it from deteriorating.
No, go ahead.
And quite often there are initiatives to try to change corporate cultures. This is a big thing that's common, is to decide, oh, my culture has a problem with something, and then management has a big initiative. They have a plan for how they want to change the culture, and they can fire people and hire people and make rules and reorganize things, and they have enormous powers to change corporate culture, and they have enormous incentives. That is, this is the main thing that makes companies valuable, and if the company isn't valuable, the CEO, their stock options aren't worth so much. So they really have a strong incentive, and nevertheless, typical corporate change initiatives take roughly 5 years, and 2/3 of them fail. And typically corporate cultures just decay over time, and companies just die. And the average company spends only 15 years in the S&P 500. And basically, even though managers have enormous powers and incentive to try to manage and improve corporate cultures, they tend to just get worse, and this is how firms die. And this is a basic fact about corporate cultures, even given all the selection power. The companies today are probably better run than they were a century ago, but it's not because individual companies get better run, it's because the badly run ones die, and the new ones try to copy the most successful existing companies.
Okay, so you're more in favor of antitrust law now than you were before you did this research, is that right?
So industries with smaller numbers of firms are less innovative.
Okay, all right, let me ask you another question. It's kind of in the same vein. So here, this is a quote from this book by Gordon Richardson that you called Not by Genes Alone. It's a book about cultural evolution. And it's about, so the demographic transition is the phrase that's used for lowered fertility, okay? Fertility rates dropping. The demographic transition is at least partly caused by the increased non-parental cultural transmission associated with modernization. Modern economies require educated managers, politicians, and other kinds of professionals who typically earn high wages and achieve high status. Accordingly, competition for such roles is fierce. People who delay marriage and child-rearing in order to invest energy and time into education and career advancement have an advantage in this competition. High-status people have a disproportionate influence in cultural transmission, so the beliefs and values that lead to success in the professional sector will tend to spread. These beliefs will tend to lower fertility, so family size will drop. Okay, is capitalism to blame for the demographic transition?
So, remember I said cultures are like sports cars. Compared to the rest of biological evolution, they're very fast and very powerful, but they break a lot. One of the key features of a culture is who are the high status people. So one of the key mechanisms of the culture is people just copy the behaviors of high status people. And they copy everything from high status people, including values, including child rearing practices, everything. So it matters enormously what counts as high status in a culture. So a culture can just go wrong by picking the wrong thing as the thing they revere, and then everybody copies that, and it can just go off the rails by, for example, that thing not promoting replacement fertility. So here's two different examples of failure. An older one, before Boyd and Richard talking about it, it's long been reported for many ancient civilizations that elites who, being elite was muchly about their wealth, then when they wanted their children to be elite, they noticed that the richest people around were people whose parents didn't have many children, because then they didn't split up their wealth up among very many children, and then they were the richest people around. So if you wanted to copy and be like the richest people, you wanted to not have very many children, so your children could be richer and higher status. So that if status just goes with individual wealth, and much of it is coming from inheritance, then that creates a society that tries to get individual wealth by having few kids, and this was a common feature of many ancient societies. Elites had very low fertility. And this was true in the Roman Empire, especially, and an emperor Augustus tried to have all sorts of policies to stop this, and he just failed. But more recently, Boyd and Richardson say, in our society, we have status that goes to often to the most educated, or the people who spent the longest in career preparation, because then they are the most impressive in their careers, and those long years of career preparation come at the expense of early life fertility. And so, you know, picking educational and career achievement is then selecting against fertility. So I'm not sure either of these are to blame on capitalism per se. Obviously, the first one can't exist if capital doesn't exist. So the existence of wealth makes the first one possible. Our world does celebrate education and career preparation, but I think even without capitalism, we probably would still. So I'm not sure.
I mean, I guess the thing I was leaning on there is the idea of people who are managers. I feel like the manager is a character who shows up in capitalism. That is the divide between the owner and the manager. And so if it's, in some sense, that figure of training yourself to be a manager, then that was my thinking.
If you pay attention to the visions many people have about a world without capitalism, almost all the visions retain managers. Pretty much all socialist visions still have organizations with managers. They just have different ways to pick the managers, but they've got managers, and the managers are often the people who have shown their ability through early career preparation. So socialism wouldn't really fix that.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily thinking socialism. Maybe we got to come up with a third thing. But okay. So here's a line from your one something of yours that I read. I've now blurred in my head, so I'm not sure what it was. One of your blog posts. You say, if nothing is done, this drift will cause many dysfunctions, including fertility fail. And I wanted to hear from you what are some of the other dysfunctions, but before you answer, I know one of them is going to be innovation, so you can talk about that. But I actually asked ChatGPT to list maladaptive cultural changes. So I'm going to give you ChatGPT's list, and you tell me whether you think these are maladaptive cultural changes of our society. It listed 5. Processed foods, sedentary lifestyles, substance abuse, environmental damage, and social media overuse. Are those maladaptive according to you, and what else? What are the other maladaptive? What's maladaptive?
Those are not obviously maladaptive. I suppose they might be. The question is, do cultures that embody some of these features, are they going to do better or worse in competition with other cultures? And that's the standard of maladaptive.
But it does depend on what the other cultures are doing, right?
So, for example, the Amish and Haredim are beating the rest of us hands down by doubling every 20 years. But
if
I'm not
we're
sure.
competing on how fast we're reproducing, but
Yes.
we might think we're competing on other fronts.
But fundamentally, if they just keep growing the way they are, and we keep growing the way we are, then they will replace us, and our culture will have failed to reproduce. Now, if we can, at some point, convince them to adopt all our cultural features, then we could win suddenly because we persuaded them, but they are onto that and very much resisting our cultural influence. So a distinctive features about these cultures is that not only are they high fertility, they're very insular. They're very resistant to influence from outsiders, and they have very high retention rate. The Amish retain 93% of their kids, bringing them back in, even after they tell them to go spend a few years on the outside and come back when they're ready. These don't seem obviously maladaptive.
Okay, so what's maladaptive besides low fertility?
Well, for example, in a world of military competition, a lack of preparation for war or inclination for war could be maladaptive. We're in a very peaceful period, but if that should end,
I mean, the Amish and the Haredim are not very...
They're pacifists, but most likely as a way to be insular. That is, one of the biggest risks in a wartime would be if all of your young men went off to the war and then socialized with the rest of the young men in war, then they might not come back to your culture. So I think as very small fractional cultures, they need to be pacifist in order to insulate the young men from those cultural influence. I think if they get large enough to have their own military units, that won't be a problem. And I predict that's what will happen to the Haredim in half century. The Haredim are already a substantial fraction of Israel. They're growing much faster than the rest of Israel. And at some point, then when they take over Israel, they will have to be non-pacifist.
Okay, so you give 3 possible solutions to this problem of cultural drift. I think you think none of them will work, but I thought we would go through them. Okay, the conservative, totalitarian, and multicultural. So just why don't you explain them?
All right, now, FYI, so this is an essay I wrote called Beware Cultural Drift. In the few weeks since I published that essay, maybe a month now, I have done a post where I tried to go through these options better and try to reorganize the categories.
Oh, okay.
But
so just say what they are now.
So one key option is deep multiculturalism. Somehow have a world where we share a world economy, where you can travel and communicate across the world, but you still have lots and lots of little different cultures who are very different. So at the moment we have what a famous essayist calls boutique multiculturalism, where we like to see lots of different clothes and food and holidays and, cute little ways of decorating your house, but on fundamental values we don't actually disagree. And I did a set of polls where I asked for 12 different things, do we need more variety and less variety than this in the world? And fundamental values is the one where people least wanted variety in the world. And so we actually at the moment don't like the idea of variety and fundamental values around the world, but the vision of deep multiculturalism, as it was outlined by Robert Nozick in his famous book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, but you can find many other expressions of this. What if we had lots of little cultures who could maintain their difference, including fundamental values toward marriage and gender and death and work and everything, and yet allow them to be different and still share an economy and governance that would keep the peace and keep a integrated world economy going, but then allow variety, and then which would then create, enough cultural variety for cultural evolution to work. It's a big ask because people just don't seem to like to allow values to differ for the people they interact with. We often use
so
governance
because other
law.
people are evil. That's
Exactly.
what it is to be evil, is to different fundamental values.
Yes, indeed. But so it's a big ask, but it would work in the sense that if you could get this going, then we could have lots and lots of little variety. We do allow the Amish and the Knights and the Haredim to live among us with quite different values, which you might be surprised by. So maybe there's some hope, but it's a big ask. So
Okay.
that's one solution.
And so you've written the world could use more cults. This is what you mean.
Right. Yes. So honestly, I kind of joined a cult when I was a tween, maybe 12. It was a religious cult, and my parents were pretty religious, but it was a different thing. And so for a year or so, I was heavily involved in this Pentecostal religious cult, and then my parents pulled me out. So I have a vivid memory for what cults are like. They're fun. And then I have a strong memory for what religion is like and what it's like to feel it and believe it and be strongly motivated, so I get that. But I still see how most people really dislike cults. And pretty much all the documentaries you see on TV about cults, it's not good. Whatever they're doing, it's not good in the documentaries.
Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Give us the other options besides the
Okay.
cult multiculturalism.
Now, just as if we look at just the fertility problem, it's easier to solve. And so my story is that I spent about 5 months in the last year really focused on fertility, trying to understand it. And there you can identify some solutions, but maybe it's hard to get people behind them. And then I came to think that this cultural drift problem was an underlying problem underneath fertility. And so I've been thinking about how we can fix that. There are ways to fix fertility that wouldn't fix cultural drift. And so even if we revive fertility, we might still suffer from drift in other ways, but hey, maybe we can get a reprieve for a while or something. So I just want to categorize, there are ways to fix fertility problem independently of fixing cultural drift.
Actually, that was one of my questions, so I'm just going to ask it right now. Suppose we could fix exactly one of these problems and not the other. Which do you pick us to fix?
Well, the whole point is if one problem is underlying the other, when you fix it, you do fix the other.
Well, so you might fix cultural drift without fixing fertility.
You would fix the processes by which fertility might get fixed, though. That is, once you fix cultural drift, then cultural evolution could produce and promote the subcultures that are more fertile.
No, but like suppose we just like, let's just take my culture, whatever that is, okay? Suppose that I just impose that on everyone in the world, and I'm also like freeze, just keep with this forever. And my culture is a culture of low fertility, so that would be no cultural drift, stable,
right.
you know, stable culture of whatever my culture is. So that fixes cultural drift, but it doesn't fix fertility. It would mean that fertility eventually.
Right. So the phrase cultural drift is a pointer to the idea that we have an ineffective cultural evolution system. So what you're describing is not an effective cultural evolution system.
I see. Okay. So I thought
We wanna
that
fix the system
drift
of
problem
cultural
was the
evolution.
problem that these big cultures were changing in kind of.
Well, that's the proximate.
Got it. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So the fundamental problem is, again, this is human superpower. It's not, I mean, intelligence was enough to get us to culture, but it's culture that made the huge difference. This is why we are spectacularly more successful than all the other animals. This cultural machine. And we have recently turned it off. And if we can't get this machine working again, we're going to crash. That's the story here. So we want to get this machine working again. One approach is to just produce enough variety through this deep multiculturalism. And that could work, except people don't seem to like it.
Okay.
What else can we do? I think the other class of options is to somehow take hold of culture and control it or manage it, as terrible as that might sound. So I think, first of all, we have to admit that conservatives who are always, you know, in the words of one famous person, standing athwart history yelling stop, had a point in that we have been allowing culture to evolve faster than we could manage, and that maybe we shouldn't have been changing it so fast. And if we could slow down the change, that would be a complement to the deep multiculturalism, and that we wouldn't need quite as many different cultures to have enough if we could just slow down the drift. But that's also a big ask. People like to change culture. People are very proud of it. So to control, in some sense, it wouldn't be enough to just stop change, because the way we express our values to ourselves and each other is pretty shallow. That is, we have values about number of children or hours of work or things like this, but these aren't sort of deep underlying values. They're more strategies and habits that we have that make sense in our world, but when our values are expressed at this shallow level, then when context changes, like when we get longer lifespans or get richer or other sorts of things, then it makes sense to change these things to adapt to those circumstances, which is what shows that they are strategies, not the deep underlying values. So if we are conservative in that way, and we refuse to change anything at that intermediate level, then we will go off the rails in the sense that we won't be able to adapt as the world changes. But if we were somehow to figure out what underlying values that we really shared at a deep level, then they wouldn't need to be redefined every time we changed our context, because they would tell us how to adapt themselves to changing context, because they would be deep values. So if we could figure out and then agree on what our deep values were, and then we wouldn't need to change them because they don't need to change with context. That's the whole point of having deep values. That's another vision.
Can I make a suggestion? How about freedom, justice, and equality?
Well, see, one common approach is we have what appear to be deep expressions. These aren't particular life strategies, they are underlying concepts, but they're kind of vague. And so they allow.
To be clear, I meant those as political values. I think we have lots of I take those to be our core political values. We have lots of other values in other contexts in our relationships and whatever. But so, yeah.
Right, but if we just agree on vague descriptions of our values, we might not actually agree on our values, and then we could get cultural drift where these words drift in meaning, like, for example, with the Constitution, where the same words change over time. As we decide that we want different values, we just change what the words mean. That doesn't really protect us from drift, because we aren't locking down. So what you need to lock down is sort of very concrete enough expressions of deep values such that they wouldn't have to change, but you would know what they were, and you could tell whether they were changing. It's also a big ask. We have enough trouble even agreeing on shallow values. Asking us to come to agree on even deeper values is pretty hard. It's maybe as hard as deep multiculturalism. So I've got a third option.
Okay.
And it's based on a form of governance that I've invented called Futarchy. And so I'm famously known for inventing ways to use prediction markets and mechanisms, and one of them is this called the decision market, a way in which you can use financial markets to have a form of governance. And the key idea is you set an ex post measurable metric of what it is you want, like say GDP, weighted over the future. And then speculators basically figure out which policies will achieve that, and the betting market actually does work to get that outcome. So under this form of governance, all you need to do is agree on what you want, i.e. how you could tell after the fact how much of what you want you got. And so if we could agree on something like that, then that's another way of agreeing on values such that it doesn't change. We'd have to agree not to change that. And then the question is, what values, if we agreed on them and expressed them in a form of governance like that, could we feel so attached to and so devoted to that we would then be willing to deal with whatever disruptions this mechanism tells us we must suffer to achieve these values, instead of letting our values drift, changing our mind, and then forcing the government to change its metrics. So Agnes convinced me that in fact, simple metrics like population or GDP or energy usage would not be inspiring enough to induce that level of devotion. I think she's right.
Liberty, justice, equality.
Right. Well,
that would work, I think.
But specific numerical metrics, counting those, could people be devoted to those metrics enough not to change those?
Probably not.
That's a big ask. So the last option here is, well, what if we could pick an inspiring future goal, like getting to the stars? And then our metric of our civilization, at least whatever part of it is agreeing to this, is the sooner we get to the stars, the better. And we're going to empower this governance mechanism to do whatever it takes to adopt policies that, in speculators' estimation, will get us to the stars faster. Could that be inspiring enough that we would be willing to say, yes, we agree, we want to get to the stars faster, we're not going to change our mind, and people are trying to change their mind, we're going to push them back and say, no, this is what we wanted, we're committed to it, and we're going to keep going. And could that be inspiring enough to get us to lock down to a set of values? And yeah, probably not. But any other metric that was inspiring to do. So Agnes might suggest like some metric of the sum of all knowledge we create. Like we say, let's just be a really knowledgeable civilization. Let's agree to be the civilization devoting itself to knowing the most. Could that be inspiring enough that people could say, yes, I accept this governance mechanism that we believe will in fact make us the civilization who knows the most, and if it makes us do stuff we don't like, we'll suck it up and say, that's the cost of being part of a great civilization that achieves this great thing. And yeah, that also may not work. But honestly, I don't have other answers. This is just a really hard one. I know maybe how to solve fertility, and you can ask if we can say how, but I don't know how to solve this other than these pretty lame, pretty speculative solutions. That's where I'm stuck. And that's why I want you to hear we're in a difficult situation. We have a deep problem of cultural drift, i.e. lack of a functioning cultural evolution system, which has been our superpower, which we've turned off. How can we turn it on again?
So you tweeted, I think at some point, that the world seems to have less interest in your solutions to its problems than in your statement of the problems. You pose, it's not just Futarchy and prediction markets, you're full of solutions to problems. Lots of different mechanisms that you proposed.
Right.
Why do you think it is that people like it when you point out problems, but don't like it when you offer solutions to the problems?
This is a different rabbit hole, but I'll just quickly summarize. I've come to think that ordinary people see others like ourselves in two different categories. There are experts and elites, and they think of us differently. So from experts, they expect knowing the most. And if they believe that you're an expert, they're willing to believe you about many things, including the diagnosis of problems. But from elites, they expect the leadership of initiating and leading social trends and organizations, and they expect them to be impressive in a wide range of ways, including social, that is what we want from celebrities, basically.
Okay, hold on.
And so,
I want to actually interrupt you. I want to interrupt you with it before you taint the data. So Robin has just drawn a distinction between experts and elites. I maybe didn't let you draw all of it, but that's okay. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to say, we'll do the vote for both me and Robin, okay? We'll do Robin first. Ask yourself, is he more of an expert or more of an elite? And you don't have to vote, but if you think Robin is more of an expert than an elite, raise your hand. Okay. All right, I'm not going to count. Let's put your hands down. If you think Robin is more of an elite than an expert, raise your hand. Okay, expert wins. Expert wins. But there are. Okay, now do me. Okay, if you think I'm more of an expert than an elite, raise your hands. Okay, put your hands down. If you think I'm more of an elite than an expert, raise your hands. Okay, so I got I'm also an expert, but I'm an expert by a smaller margin than you are. Okay, go. Yeah.
All right, so I think the way the world works is people want leadership from elites, and they want information from experts. And for the purpose of proposing new things to do in the world, they want that to come from elites. That is, their main question about reform proposals and initiatives is, will people back it? Will enough other people back it that it will happen, and will it be managed well? And that's what they want to come from elites. From experts, they might want to hear diagnosis of problems and understanding the way the world works, but then they want an elite to manage the expert in the purpose of managing a project to make stuff happen. And I didn't realize that, so I've been trying to propose reforms to the world all these years, and I didn't realize they didn't want to hear reforms from me because I'm not plausibly an elite. But hopefully I can someday get elites to take on some of my proposals, and then they can be the properly celebrity impressive sort of people that you would be willing to follow on such a campaign to do big changes to the world.
Okay, unrelated. There's a blog post where you compare the world as it currently is, especially the richer parts of the world, to tenured faculty in terms of being stagnant. So I'm just going to read this comparison. Compared to untenured but tenure-track academic faculty, Robin and I are both tenured, by the way, most of whom will later get tenure, tenured professors put in less effort, are less focused on doing big win projects, are less willing to change locations, research subfields, or classes taught. They publish less, they change their minds less, but they're more pompous in their speech. They complain more in public about outcomes for their local groups, and they're more willing to advocate radical changes in other parts of society. They are willing to express outrage when they have positions of authority that aren't threatened by such actions. Okay, says tenured faculty. This seems a plausible guide to how our civilization changes as it gets rich and old due to falling fertility. We are now all tenured. Not only do the richer, older people among us get this way, everyone does to some extent, since we're also influenced by each other. We complain more loudly, and we frame the minor inconveniences of others as moral outrages that they must not tolerate. But we also less frequently change jobs, locations, and our minds. Okay, so I guess a question I have in reading this about how, it seems like you're sort of saying that our civilization is actually quite stagnant and stable, but then you also want to say in a bunch of places that our values are changing really fast all the time. So how are those claims compatible?
Well, one of the luxuries we indulge ourselves in being rich is the luxury of changing our values rapidly and often. That is, when you're poor, near the edge of survival, there's a lot of luxuries you can't afford to indulge in, and radically changing your values is widely seen as one of those. Most poor peasants in the world through history haven't been that eager to change how they do things around there. They've been pretty focused on making sure they have enough to eat, and they mostly want to do things the way they've been doing them before. The world gets more interested in changes in fashion and innovation and in politics, etc., when we're richer and can afford them. So there's this old stereotype that when nations got especially poor, that's when revolutions happened. It's just not true. Revolutions tend to happen as nations were getting richer, and people raise their expectations, and we're hoping for more, and that's when revolutions have happened. So as we're getting richer, we feel we can afford to make bigger changes in values. That is, you might think, so imagine somebody said, let's change the US Constitution to have 3 legislatures and senators have 7-year terms, et cetera, and somebody would go, how dare you change this important thing that's so fundamental to our society? You'd be risking all these important things by making these changes. That's how we feel about the details of our political system, but in terms of our values, we just go wild changing things enormously, and we could list some of those. And if you ask, aren't you afraid that you'll mess things up, that, that our world was functioning before, and when you change these things, they won't function anymore, and people don't seem very concerned. They think, well, it'll go okay, because we're all pretty rich, and if there's problems, we'll think about it later. So I think we are rich and therefore willing to make these big changes.
Okay, I'm going to list some of the changes that you, this is from a different blog post. Okay. A big rise in parental attention, so parents paying more attention to their kids, waiting until much later to marry, longer career prep, a preference for cities, great declines in religion, patriotism, and militarism, far more acceptance of homo and transsexuality, far stronger norms against sexist or racist language, and national cultures merging into a global culture, especially among elites. So the last is the idea is elites everywhere around the world, kind of the same. The people that differ are going to be the poorer people. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what Robin is talking about when he says changing values, those are some of the values that you take to value the change, right?
And those are especially the ones that are causing fertility decline.
Okay. I want to ask you about libertarianism. So, you're a libertarian, sort of. Yeah, I mean, every libertarian says that. Okay.
And many of the non-libertarians
libertarians don't like belonging to a group. So, even when you say, are you a libertarian, they're like, I'm sympathetic to that. So there's an interesting connection between libertarianism and deep multiculturalism, which is not an accident that Nozick is a proponent, right, of deep multiculturalism. Which is, I'm going to quote a line from you about the core of libertarianism as you see it. Libertarians hope to share a government without sharing a community or culture. It's kind of like an agree to disagree thing, as I see it. Why would libertarians prefer to share a government rather than just having a lot of small governments that are separate from each other? That is, why have government be the big tent, but then culture be inside of that?
Well, when we have lots of little governments that don't have a shared larger government to account. So in the United States, we have counties and states and then the nation. And we have many kinds of governments that happens at the county level. But there's other kinds of governance that happens at the national level. So this first vision you're talking about is, what if there were just counties and there were no higher levels? Then often you might not be able to support as much trade between the counties, and they might go to war with each other. And so we might rather have an encompassing governance that prevented all that war and allowed for peaceful trade, even if it allowed the local counties, for example, to have their own very different values. So in fact, the initial law in the United States really did allow each county to have completely different laws. And there was a long evolution of US law that's changed that, mostly through a series of moral crusades where people, like with slavery or prostitution or other sorts of things, they said, you just can't allow those other counties to do these evil things. And they insisted that the Supreme Court make rulings that made those values be shared. And now we're in a world where it's much harder for counties to differ. And that's an analog to this issue is how much could each county say differ?
Okay, so I think it's a couple months ago you had this post, maybe longer than that, on what is culture? And you said that culture is coordination. It's an equilibrium in a game where the game has multiple equilibria. So the idea is there's some constraints, there's some bit of land and there's some possibilities for growing food in the land, and there's some height that people are, or whatever. So there's external constraints. But then there's like a variety of ways that that group of people could sort of solve the problem of how to stay alive and live together. Like, for instance, they could speak a variety of languages. And so each of those different modes of coordinating, I'm summarizing what I take to be your point, you can correct me if that's wrong, is culture. So culture is these coordination points. And so it seems like government is culture in the sense if it's going to be a coordination to the extent of we don't kill each other and we trade with each other. That seems like coordination. So maybe the thought is that it's all coordination and you do want some coordination, but you want the coordination to stop at you want us to coordinate like only on the basics, but not try to coordinate any further than that? Is that sort of how a libertarian thinks about things? I'm
not going to claim what libertarians think about this, but
okay.
I
According to your definition of libertarian, which is like they share a government and don't share a culture, I'm saying that doesn't work if culture is coordination and government is coordination.
So the way to be most sure that cultural evolution functions is to not have any coordination on any features of culture and let all the different cultures fight it out in any way they can. In some sense, that's the most robust kind of cultural competition. So the question is, are you willing to maybe coordinate on just a few dimensions and take the risk that those are key dimensions of cultural evolution, and by coordinating on them, you're going to prevent the evolution of those key dimensions. But what you might be buying is an ability to share a planet or a solar system in peace with a huge economy where we all trade with each other, as opposed to fragmenting into tiny little autarky units that can't do so much. That's a key trade-off, and I'm not sure where exactly to sit, but I would like to maybe not go to war all the time and maybe trade with each other. What is it that it would take to get those things? How much am I risking not having sufficient cultural evolution? Because maybe, look, it is actually plausibly true that in the last 10,000 years, a great deal of progress was driven by war. In fact, war was plausibly one of the biggest drivers of innovation over the last 10,000 years. And we've turned that off, and do we really want to turn it on again?
Okay, I'm going to ask you two more questions, because I've already gone over my time, even my self-indulgent time. And then we're going to have cookies and take a break, and then we'll come back for your guys' questions. Okay, two questions. This is hard. I have a lot of questions I didn't ask. Okay, 2 years ago we talked about the sacred. And you have a theory about the sacred that we won't go through in detail. The video is up so you can watch it. When something is sacred, we see the thing from afar in order to see it together. That's your theory. Shouldn't the sacred have like built-in ways of resisting drift?
Culture is a recent invention on the planet. It's a sports car that goes much faster than all the little plodding tricycles that all the other animals use, but it breaks. And it's not very sophisticated. So if you look at your heart or your muscles and your habits of sleeping at night, your body biologically is an enormously complicated, subtle machine that's been honed for all sorts of various complicated things. And if you have an inclination to sleep at night, that's different in the day, that's probably a good thing. But culture is not this complicated, honed machine. It's very crude, but very powerful. And that's why you shouldn't expect something like the sacred to have all sorts of extra bells and whistles that would adjust to circumstances to get things right. Maybe in another, 10,000 years it will, but at the moment it's just crude. So, now, definitely, for many ancient civilizations, it definitely seemed like they had a value of preserving their culture and preserving their most sacred values. That was something they felt they were trying to resist changes in. And we do seem to be changing faster than they did, and we also seem to less have this norm of being afraid of changing our values through some fear of polluting the sacred. We often seem to think the most sacred thing we can do is to change our values. We have made that, in fact, more sacred than anything else. We get the most accolades and the most respect for people who are the activist leaders of value change.
Okay, last question. So you have, a view, which I'm just bringing this up in case you want to ask Robin about it in the Q&A, that we should cut medicine in half. We're doing too much medicine. We're not getting enough bang for our buck medicine-wise. So we could be doing half as much medicine, we'd be just as healthy. And now that's what you think like the whole country should do, but obviously none of us is in charge of the whole country. So you also offer people suggestions at a personal level for how to take measures to like do less medicine. Like, so you have this specific advice like, go to a big hospital but only have procedures done that they do at small hospitals, and you have a clever explanation for why you should do that. Anyway, you have stuff like that with cut medicine in half. And I want to know, when it's like stop cultural drift, is there anything locally, personally, that we can do in our lives if we want to be, you know, following your advice of turning the cultural evolution system back on? How do we live in such a way to promote its being turned back on? Besides for having more kids.
So, in the medical case, I'd say you're all just trusting your doctors way too much. Like, just have this suspicion, maybe they're lying, maybe they don't know, maybe you should check some other way the things they tell you. And maybe just, if they aren't making a better than average case for doing something, don't do it. That's the cut medicine in half. Like, do half the stuff they recommend, figure out which half, and not do the other half. That's being suspicious and distrusting of your doctor. So with respect to culture, I want you to start distrusting your culture. And that's a big ask, I know, because it's the most warm, fuzzy thing you have. You were brought up in your culture, it told you to trust it, you have been trusting it, you love it, it's been your cozy home all these years, and it's what's telling you that when there's new values, you should adopt them because they're morally right, the old ones were morally wrong, and you've been doing that all your life. Your life isn't as long as mine, but still, we've all been doing it all our lives, and I want you to pause and ask, should you really trust it? Is it a system that's like looking at all these contingencies and working out the best thing for you, or is it just this blind thing that's heading off in random directions with no one controlling it or even foreseeing where it's going? That's the thing you're hitching yourself to. Is that smart? Maybe distrust your culture.
But if people did distrust culture, wouldn't that cause more cultural change?
For a moment.
Okay. So maybe this is the fourth solution. Somehow everyone starts to distrust culture, and then
We just ask more fundamentally, like, what are the fundamental things you need out of life? You don't want to die, maybe you want some friends, maybe you want some, you know, legacy, and don't listen to all the other things culture tells you you want. Maybe just figure out the few things you can be most sure you want and focus on those.
okay, we're gonna take a break. So there's cookies at the back, and yeah, cookies and hot chocolate, and then we'll come back and do Q&A. If you ask a question, you get a t-shirt or tote bag. You can get your t-shirt or tote bag either right after you ask the question or when the event is over. We're gonna go till about 10:45. Jermaine, who's sitting there in the back, he has t-shirts in the tote bag, so you can go up to him at any point, either then or at the very end. Yeah, Earl, why don't you go ahead, ask the first question.
Thanks, yeah, so I appreciate you coming and sort of sharing these thoughts, this argument. I'm trying to wrap my mind around how you are conceptualizing culture. The way that I'm approaching it, I'm thinking about it like George Lakoff, like conceptual metaphors. I've heard you mention a couple of metaphors for how you're reasoning about culture, or allude to. One is a culture is kind of like a discrete individual entity. You know, cultures are competing, they're like fighting for like survival. There's a kind of scarcity, like only some cultures can survive, that's kind of what you're pointing to. Another metaphor you used was like a sports car. Like it's finely tuned, it can be kind of like brittle or like not particularly robust. So I'm hearing those two sort of conceptual metaphors, these kind of mental models for how culture operates that you're using to reason about. I'm trying to reconcile that with some of the ways that I think about culture. So for me, like I found it really interesting, cultural dimensions. So Geert Hofstadter. So thinking about, you talk about like values a little bit. Values kind of in the same space of preferences. Hofstadter, you know, through his research, has like 5 or 6 different dimensions by which cultures differ. Like a focus on individualism versus collectivism, like strong gender differences versus kind of more androgynous, how acceptable like power differences are. So I got a 2-part question for you. One is, how do you reconcile like that, like understanding cultures in terms of these constituent kind of values, where maybe the culture doesn't have a kind of strong, definite identity, but it's actually like more like broken up in terms of these kind of dimensions. And here's where the rubber meets the road, going back to the sports car metaphor. To make that more concrete, would you say China has an old culture or a young culture?
I have no idea how to categorize China on old versus young, but cultural evolution is a process by which people copy other people's behavior, especially according to status, and then have some shared norms and shared concepts of what counts for status. That's the fundamental mechanism by which people copy behaviors and learn them. So it's a mechanism for innovation because it's a mechanism for copying, but it has some parameters, and those parameters are things that are hard not to share. So for example, once you decide that wealth is your metric of status, that works because other people around you share that metric, and you're trying to judge how to impress people by trying to do the things that will impress them. And so there are some features of social equilibria that are shared, and therefore those are the things that a culture has internally as its features that then are different from other cultures. So it's this machine with some parameters, and the different settings of the parameters are in essence how different cultures differ. So they have different norms, different values that they're supposed to share, different ways they decide who to copy from. But I mean, I think of more generally, I would just say in my essay, Beware Cultural Drift, I evolved my definition of culture to just be most everything that's not hard to see, understand, or control. That is, say in a corporation, there's the official powers of each job and who's in each job, and there's the budgets for each department, and there's the shipping amount. Those are all legible things that you can see and understand and control. And then the company has all this other stuff you can't see, control, or understand, and some of that stuff is sort of shared. That is, once part of the company has it, the other parts have to have like a matching thing. And then that's the thing the company has that makes it different from other companies is, say, a norm for honesty, or a norm for doing things fast, or documenting everything. So once a company has this norm, everything must be documented. It's going to be a company-wide norm. It might be different from other companies, and then it'll be hard for any one person in that company to deviate. And then that's the company culture. Is all these ways in which this company is different from others across it, but in all these other ways that are hard to see and control. Like when the manager wants to change culture, he can change who's in charge of his job, or what budget departments have, but then there's all this other stuff he doesn't have much direct control over, and that's culture. So that's my best way to describe it, but it is noteworthy that it is hard to describe and define. That's an interesting fact about it.
So you see like the analyzing culture in terms of dimensions is kind of secondary to this sort of more like the way that the culture kind of coalesces this.
Well, first you have to understand it as a machine. Like, how does it work? How have humans beat all the other animals? What's the mechanism? And then you can see this machine has some knobs, and then you can talk about the dimensions.
Okay, so going back to the machine level. All right, thank you.
I actually want to ask a follow-up on Earl's question. Because, so your views evolved from the view that I described, which is that the culture is a particular coordination point, to this culture is the stuff you can't see. I kind of like your old view better, so I want to ask why, like, for example, language. I think on your old view, language is part of culture, clearly. On your new view, it doesn't seem hard to see. It seems pretty obvious. We can have books explaining it, dictionaries and things. So is language now not a part of culture in your new view? Or if it is, then in what senses? Can you say more about what the hard to see means?
Well, I would think all the ways that one language influences other aspects of culture are hard to see. That is, you can see the language itself, but how do you figure out how it changes other things? And so you could mandate people use a different language, but you might not be able to mandate all these other ways to use the language in order to change how your company runs, right? So that's maybe a way to see. So for the purpose of corporate culture, I thought it especially useful to separate culture from the other things managers can just control, right? Because the things that managers can directly control, it turns out that can't be a big part of how companies differ. Because managers can just look at other companies and copy what they do. The things that are easy to see and control, then they can just be easily copied. Although things in your company that can't be easily copied are because they're actually hard to see and understand.
Okay, please.
Hi, thank you for your time. My general question is sort of like why we should care about cultures persevering, I guess, especially in relation to other things that we might care about. So one thing I'm thinking about is it's like, it seems like it might be an acceptable trade-off if, for instance, prioritizing higher well-being in a culture means that it lasts less long. So yeah, I was just wondering why you think that we should care about our cultures persevering.
So there's two viewpoints to look at culture from. One is this outside view of a Darwin or an analyst of the whole system and how it works. And another is of a person in a culture wondering how I want to believe or act or how I want to influence culture. So if you look at, say, the newspaper section called Culture, it's not about what cultural evolution people would define as basically all behavior. They mean a much more limited part of culture when they say culture. And that's more about the kinds of ways that we try to coordinate to change culture or to preserve it or to emphasize it. And that's an inside view of culture, I would say, is in the culture section of the newspaper. And then the cultural evolutionists standing on the outside trying to understand the whole process of predicting what will happen. So I've mostly been talking from the outside, but a bit from the inside. From the outside, I can say, evolution was trying to select for biological creatures and cultures that did want to persist and survive. That is adaptive. If it happened to create creatures or cultures that don't care if they survive, plausibly, those will soon go away, and the mistake won't be remade very often. And your confusion about whether you want your culture to persist won't be a problem in the future. People will know they want their culture to persist because that's obviously the sort of thing that is adaptive, right? Cultures are more likely to persist if they try to persist, right? So we might say, our cultures are so maladaptive at the moment that you could possibly be confused about whether you want your culture to persist. That's a pretty strong sign that something's gone wrong from the outside point of view. Nevertheless, from your point of view, you've inherited a culture, you've inherited some values, and you can ask yourself, yeah, but what do I want? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm not going to tell you what you want. I don't know that you want your culture to persist. I don't know that you want to have descendants of any sort whatsoever. I don't know if you care about the future, but I do know that cultural evolution will promote cultures who do care. And if the current one doesn't, then it'll go away and be replaced by ones that do.
I wonder whether your outside view is outside enough. So like dinosaurs didn't make it, right? So there's no dinosaurs around today. Ferns are still around. So on your view, ferns are the real winners as against dinosaurs. But it seems obvious to me that evolution-wise, like dinosaurs are awesome. So evolution evolved something awesome, the dinosaur, and then it evolved this kind of lame thing, the fern, that just sticks around and around, and you know that. But my outside view says dinosaurs are better than ferns.
You've seen birds, though, right?
Yeah.
You're not one of these people who deny birds as a real thing, right?
No, birds are real, and I grant that they evolved from some dinosaurs.
They are descendants of dinosaurs.
But they're not awesome things. The awesome ones were in the past where they were like huge.
Awesome.
Like those giant slothy things too. Oh, there were all these cool things in the past that died out. They were cool. And
right.
That was an amazing feat, even if there were no humans around to appreciate it. And just the fact that the ferns keep going and going, algae, things like that doesn't make them better. If I were going to choose to be a species, I would be like a species like dinosaurs. I would take this as a question. I could imagine choosing being the dinosaur species over being the fern species, because there's other values out there.
And that's an inside view, and I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. I'm just going to say, if you ask, will that view survive cultural evolution? Like the view that says, it's okay if we don't have descendants as long as we have a spectacular life now, I say, that's going to be selected out, right?
Well, there's two questions. One is like, are my descendants going to die? And the other is, are like future beings, including from other planets and stuff, going to find our texts and stuff and be like, oh, these were the dinosaurs, and these other people were the fern ones, and I'm going to be like the dinosaurs and not the ferns. So whether you survive or not, I do think is partly a function of how awesome you are, because if you're awesome, then later beings are going to want to copy you.
So cultural descendants aren't just your children. That's important to realize, right? Cultural descendants are everybody who copies something of what you are in some way, even if it's through cultural transmission channels, not through children. So you have more ways to have cultural descendants, then you have more competition to have cultural descendants. More others can compete with you to make descendants. But you might think, yeah, I won't have biological descendants, but I'm going to make this artwork and it will be buried, and when they find it, they will be just so impressed. And then they will copy that art, and my art culture descendants will go on. That's a way you
Okay,
last.
fair. That is another way to try to last for a long time. I stand refuted there. Okay. Thank you for the question.
So, sort of building off of what you just said. So, if there's sort of an imperative to last, to have your culture continue, but at the same time, if the only way to do that is to shape our culture so much that it becomes something beyond recognition, sort of, how is that maintaining our cultural genes, if you will?
I mean, evolution, biological, cultural, it doesn't care how much you feel alive or similar to your descendants. It mainly cares that you have them. So actually, there's this topic of AI risk, which I've known for a long time because one of the big talkers in this area was a co-blogger of mine 15 years ago. And a generalization from that discussion, I can say, is two robust things evolution produces. One is a rivalry toward coexisting creatures who could compete with you or your descendants over resources. But another one is an indulgence toward your descendants, even when they might be very different from you. Though both of those are robust things we should expect evolution to produce, both in DNA and culture. So you should expect to be tolerant of your descendants differing from you, and nevertheless you'll still want to help them and promote them in a way you wouldn't be so tolerant of a coexisting creature competing with you being different. You'll be very suspicious and wary of that, because that would be what natural selection promotes.
Follow up if I may. So you seem to view all of this as sort of a kind of a process that will happen, and that's just something to observe. And yet, so, I just wonder, in that case, why do you dedicate so much time to the question of how can we save our culture? What does it impel you to do that?
I mean, if we're thinking of jumping off a cliff or running and you didn't realize on the cliff and you would fall off and die, I might warn you and say, you don't have to jump off that cliff and die. We're in a competitive environment, and the overall process isn't something we can change or defy, but how well we do can depend on what we do. And I might say, hey everybody, we're heading toward this cliff. We are, being like the Roman Empire on a path to decline. Could we find a way to prevent that? Let's look, please. Maybe we can't, but I'd like us to try. And even if we could slow down the decline, find a way to pass more of what we are and value on to the others who will replace us, those all seem valuable to me, and that's not inevitable. The overall process of evolution continuing seems more inevitable, but we don't have to lose as much if we will just change what we do.
Thank you.
I want to ask one thing before I answer your question, which it's related to the previous question. I know I said I was refuted, but I've come back. So it seems to me that it's true that if we were awesome and then aliens came to our planet and they discovered our relics and they're like, these people are awesome, I want to be like them, then that would count, they would be our descendants in some sense. But I think that wanting to bring that about isn't the same thing as wanting descendants. And I'm going to relate this to something you've said to me. I've asked you, Robin, okay, do you want to be honored? Do you seek honor? Do you seek applause? And you've said that you want to be basically honored for things where you yourself recognize that those are things that you should be honored for, right? So not necessarily just people randomly clapping at stuff you do, but clapping for things that really are valuable. So why not think that's what we want as a civilization? Yes, we want to be imitated. We want future people, including our descendants, to copy us. So we don't just want to go on. We want to be, but we want to be copied for stuff where it's worth copying that stuff. where it's actually good. And if there were some idiot aliens that came to us and they were going to copy all our worst stuff, be like, yeah, I don't care whether I live on in those aliens. I would care about being honored by beings who can perceive what's actually valuable and honoring me for that. And that's the only kind of descendant I'm really interested in.
So as I've said, one of the key elements of cultural evolution is our status markers. That is, the key mechanism is copying high status people, by which we mean people we are honestly impressed by. And one of the biggest ways cultures vary is in what counts as being impressive. So you have embraced some of your culture's concepts of what's impressive and who should count for higher. And those elements of your culture may not be dysfunctional. I'm not so sure. Some elements of who we honor seems to be dysfunctional, but the more you are embedded in your culture and have accepted its values and won't change, then that's just it for you. But the process of cultural evolution will continue not just to create impressive people, but to change the standards by which we judge impressiveness. That's a key element of culture. So we could say future people will copy the things they think are deservedly impressive and valuable to copy. You might disagree with them, and I can't tell you who's right there.
Please.
Yeah, so I guess my question is like the mechanism of how cultures rise and fall. So with a culture like the Amish, like a lot of their success seems to be because they're insular and they can resist all the like outside culture. But as they grow bigger and bigger and make up a bigger proportion of like the population, it will become more difficult for them to become insular. And when we're at that point, will it be the case that they've been taking features of our culture and then they'll stop being distinct? Or is it the case that I guess they just keep on growing as they grow? I guess the question is, as they grow, how do they maintain their insularity?
So think of it as a surface area to volume ratio issue. That is, the bigger they are, the more of them can be inside, only interacting with others of them. It's the ones on the surface who have the most risk of being polluted by influence from the outside culture. So the bigger they get, the more of them can be inside, not on the surface, and so they're most at risk when they're small, because most of the people they live near, or family, etc., are all outside their culture. So a very new cult is very much at risk of going away because it's very hard for it to be insular, right? They've got 50 people, and each person of those 50 people, all of the rest of the family are outside, and all their coworkers are outside, and all their neighbors are outside. It's really hard. But as they get bigger, they can have more interactions with others internal, and then it's easier. Now, say the Amish for a long time were farmers, and they were trying to stay away from cities because, being rural, they could be more isolated from each other. But as they got larger, they took all the farming jobs, and then they needed to take other jobs. So for example, in the last generation, they have moved to non-farming jobs, only 25% farming now, and they've taken over many rural small businesses. So they're trying to, again, stay away from others, but now they're having more contact because small businesses have customers, etc., and relationships, suppliers, people who repair, etc. But so that's a way in which, as they get bigger, they have more contacts because they have to move into parts of the economy and locations which just naturally have more contacts. But that's going in one direction, but the other effect is just getting larger. More things can just be internal, right? So once they take over a whole county, say, they can take over all the jobs in the county, and then they're all interacting internally, and they're suffering less outside contact and the risk of being recruited on the outside.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. In a nutshell, my question is why now? Because you mentioned sort of this distinction between a world where you have a bunch of competing cultures, and today you have something more like a monoculture of the wealthy. But the way I see it is sort of, that monoculture of the wealthy didn't start today. At least since the Industrial Revolution, to an extent, at least in the US, there was a certain, monoculture of the wealthy, and we've been, mostly sort of fine. I mean, that culture has evolved, and there's been crises, and it's addressed issues before. So what makes today different? Why do you think this is such an exigent issue right now?
So the Roman Empire took many centuries to fall. Even if the fundamental problems it had were there much earlier on, it just took a long time for that to express. And same for the Greek Empire before, it took many centuries to fall. And plausibly, we will take many centuries to fall. I'm telling you about it because I figured it out lately. That's why I'm talking about it now. This isn't an immediate problem this year or this decade even. This is a long-term problem, but it's a pretty fundamental one. So my history, as I said, is I got paying attention to fertility, 8 months or so ago, and getting into that, I realized it was a bigger problem than I had thought, because I learned that as population declines, innovation will grind to a halt, and innovation is one of the things that makes our societies liberal, so liberality will probably fall away. And we'd have several centuries of a falling population, declining economy, innovation grinding to a halt, loss of liberality. That's pretty disturbing. I was thinking about how to fix that, and then I realized, oh, there's this deeper underlying problem, and so now I'm telling you about it. I'm just telling you about it now because I figured it out now. And you might think, well, why didn't anybody else figure out this before? And so I talked to a number of high-profile people in the world of cultural evolution, and they apparently know all about this. They just haven't written about it, and they don't feel very inclined to tell people about it. I'm not sure why. I'm telling you about it. But you go ask them, and they know about it. They know that cultural evolution is crude and it can go off the rails in certain ways, and they're well aware of that, and they believe, as Boyd and Richardson said in their quote that she gave, is that, yeah, our culture is declining fertility, probably because of this way culture goes off the rails. And there's no rush here. You've got a lot of years, maybe, but still, this is a really hard problem. I'm just telling you now because I figured it out now.
So the point you make about cultural evolution is, in the old days, cultures were each responsible for their own success, and each were responsible for feeding itself and reproducing. If it didn't do it, die off. That seems to be not the case anymore in a large number of aspects. For example, a lot of new international challenges or national challenges that wouldn't have been the case in the eras you're describing. Like, for instance, there's world wars, there's great power conflicts, there's climate change, there's everything going on with AI. So what makes you think that we can go back to individual cultures being responsible for their own success when everything we've seen moving in a direction of larger crises, larger conflicts that require a larger group of people to solve?
You're pointing to a number of world problems the world faces, and that's a rationale for having world-level organizations or governance. And to form those, that comes at the expense of cultural variation, and so then we would face a choice between solving world problems through world governance or having sufficient cultural variety to not have cultures collapse. I might settle this dispute by noticing that we're not actually solving any of those problems. So this hope you're having that world governance will solve the problems is not solving them anyways. So maybe we would in the future, but we're just not doing that now.
Well, I think your hope that cultures can diagonally by their own hand is also broken, because now cultures can create externalities. Like, for instance, if a culture creates...
They always could.
Well, it's different now, because the culture can create so much pollution. They're not necessarily going to feel that, but it's going to negatively affect everyone else. And so traits that aren't optimizing for human survival can be selected.
I will point out that I did swallow my pride and propose large-scale governance as a potential solution through what I call the Futarchy mechanism tied to a metric like when we get to the stars. And that would, in fact, induce people to solve these global coordination problems. That is, a governance tied to an objective measure of long-term, civilization capacity would directly, empower people to propose policies that would get approved to address those problems. So it has other problems, but that's not one of them.
Hi, so when you've been talking about this kind of cultural evolution, as in it's kind of like a natural selection of cultures almost, that makes me think of all of these cultures are evolving, and eventually we'll reach one culture that is able to sustain itself. When we've reached one culture, kind of is what you've been talking about, that's not self-sustaining. Do you think that are we stuck in a loop where if we're not able to reach something that sustains itself and it just collapses and we end up back at the beginning with a cycle of smaller cultures? Do you think that's something that will ever happen, or is that just not the natural, not how it's going to work, and we're just going to go in a loop of something if we're not able to naturally reach one of your solutions?
So the main scenarios I offered were, One scenario is the rise and fall of civilizations, but each fall doesn't fall to the same depth as the previous fall. So, after the end of the Roman Empire, technology was at a higher level than before the Roman Empire, right? And after our civilization falls, I think we'd still have electricity and cars and running water. And so we wouldn't fall all the way to where we were at the end of the Roman Empire. We could have this rise and fall and eventually get to the stars and, eventually do stuff. So that's one scenario. It's not hopeless, but it's sad. Another scenario is we could somehow manage to share a rich economy that's peaceful and trades a lot through deep multiculturalism. Somehow we allow enough variety. That, I told you, was a pretty hard ask. And the other approach was we somehow take control of cultures through Futarchy, and we empower them to pursue some constant long-term goal that we can agree is a goal we want to retain as constant, and we inspires us enough to hold on to it, and then we don't collapse, and we just keep rising toward that goal. Those are the three scenarios I offered. The first one's most likely. First one, we failed to prevent the collapse, and we just keep rising and falling.
I just want to note that, I think you're kind of a Malthusian at a kind of abstract level, because what Malthus thought was that there would be good times in which there would be enough food, but that a population would grow more quickly than the food supply could grow, and then you'd get something, either starvation or war, or infanticide, basically, what he calls immorality. I think it's basically infanticide, and you get lots of deaths, and then it would go back down again, and then you get eventually another period. And he just thought it would go through these cycles, and that there was no equilibrium point. There was no balancing point for humanity, because we were never going to be able to balance population against food supply. And your thought is not about us getting enough food, but it's about reproduction being somehow balanced against now what? Culture? Innovation?
So cycle theories of history are not invented by me. They go way back. They differ in terms of the timescale of the cycle and also the mechanism of rise and fall. And there's a lot of literature on different mechanisms of rise and fall in the history of the literature on cycles, theories of history. This is a particular mechanism that stands out to me as it's there and it's happening. And so I'm willing to think through how does it play out. So this cycle is a cycle of competition producing technology and wealth, which then creates an merged culture, which then fails to have cultural evolution, but then cultural drift until it gets so bad that you reignite cultural evolution and repeat the cycle.
Okay, so it's something like the tragedy of our own success.
Right.
For us to succeed culturally is going to be for us to turn off cultural evolution. But actually it's very similar to Malthus, right? Because it's when we start to succeed with agriculture, we have more food, then we over-reproduce. And then...
So in my essay, Beware Cultural Drift, I emphasize a point that we haven't actually talked about here, which is the idea is there's between unit evolution and within unit evolution. So there's within corporate evolution, and then there's between corporation evolutions. And similarly with species, there's evolution within species and between. And when units get larger, there's more internal innovation. And so as we merge the world into one big world's culture, we have enormously faster internal cultural evolution. Our innovation is getting faster, wealth is getting faster, technology is developing, but we're losing between cultural evolution. And I argue that in fact, between evolution matters more than within evolution. And we're missing that part, and we're going to pay for it soon, or in a few seconds.
Thanks.
So I'm trying to get my head around the time horizon of cultural competition. And so one thought I have is that perhaps creating more cultural variation and diversity in order to promote competition that you'll have is shortening the time horizon. So, and maybe what we want is sort of, maybe this between and in cultural competition is helpful. We want more in cultural competition in order to create mature cultures to compete against each other. So instead of, I think you use the analogy like, the more concentrated industries become antitrust, the less innovation we have. But another analogy we could use is perhaps like a human baby is not as good at competing as a human adult. So what if we allow cultures to sort of mature before they compete? Would we get sort of more fit cultures that would survive for longer?
So corporate culture, I think, is a good analogy to work with because we have so much more data on it and we understand it so much better. So corporate cultures just don't get mature, they just rot and go get that. It's not a thing where they get mature, it's not happening. So that suggests to me that larger macro cultures getting mature is also just not a thing. They either decay or some discipline, restrains that by selection pressures. So that's my simplest story, is we need selection pressures to prevent decay.
I wanted to ask a little bit about how you envision Futarchy sort of helping with the cultural drift problems. So, as I understand Futarchy, and correct me if I sort of envision it wrong in this instance, we set some goal and there's some policy proposed to achieve said goal, some cultural artifact. And then once that artifact is chosen, or that policy chosen, there are people who bet against it and people who bet for it. Which seems to imply that once it's chosen, there are people it'll be in their best interest to make sure the policy doesn't achieve the cultural goal, because then their bets come true, and then they're rewarded in the market. Is this true?
So in Futarchy, you have betting markets before we choose policy, asking if we adopt the policy, what outcomes will happen, and if we don't adopt the policy, what outcomes will happen. And then we pay off the bets based on what actually happens. So you will certainly end up with some people with a stake to try to make the policy work, and other people with a stake to try to make it not work. But turns out that happens in all the other governance mechanisms we've ever seen. Any organization that adopts a policy, there are people who opposed it who will try to make it not work, and there are people who supported it who will try to make it work. That's just a problem we've had with governance forever. So it's not a new problem introduced by this particular mechanism.
But usually in organizations, the people who are trying to make a policy not work do it because they believe that there's a better policy to achieve said goal. Here it seems the people who don't believe in the policy have a financial incentive to make sure the goal is never achieved.
And they've always had those incentives. Again, if you haven't had much experience with organizational politics, you will. And I can assure you that in all organizations, when people push on different sides about a decision, somebody wins and somebody loses, and the losers will want to take it down out of pure cussedness sometimes, out of wanting to prove that those people are wrong, all sorts of reasons. But people just have a lot of reasons in most organizations. Some of them have reasons to want to have things work well, and some of them have reasons to want to make them not work, and that's just how it's always been. So that's going to continue in any mechanism we have in the future, and it continues in the mechanism I propose.
Aren't you giving them a lot of extra reasons though? Like on top of all of those reasons, now they have these financial incentives, and it's not only people in the organization, right, but anyone who bet, which might be, lots and lots of people. So you're like hugely increasing the number of people who have an incentive to make something not work, and adding an incentive.
It's probably only a minor increase in the number, not hugely, and the size, the incentive. The quantities involved don't have to be huge. But this is about the details of Futarchy. But again, this is a proposal, and mainly what we need is just more experiments to, address your concerns, to show you that it works out okay. We've had some experiments, we need more. So I would mainly say, look, I have some theoretical reasons to believe it's not a problem, but you should be much more convinced by just data showing how it actually works. And we're capable of producing that data, so we should just do that and reassure you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. My question is about how likely do you see your solution of deep multiculturalism playing out in a society that has the underlying thread of capitalism? My question is rooted in an example that's analogous to the Amish. I'm thinking of tribal groups in India. It's an example of a deeply multicultural society where this tribe may also be insular in a sense, high fertility rates as well. However, since the 1990s, since there was an increase in market deregulation and liberalization in India, you see a profound kind of force of assimilation that even reaches the most hard to reach tribes, and this force of wanting them to modernize, and that has also resulted in lower fertility rates. Some of these tribes are, like, their population rates are decreasing. So my question is, to what extent do you see the solution of deep multiculturalism existing in a system of capitalism?
So when people say the word capitalism, I try to imagine what alternative they have in mind. And one place I go to is all the writings on socialism. That's one concrete example of a non-capitalism. Socialists tend to want to retain industry, large-scale organizations, and division of labor. They just want a different person in control of the organizations and a different maybe way of handing out, residual profits. But that doesn't address your issue here. This is an issue of just integrating into a larger world, and to the extent that there are gains to be had by integrating into a larger world, this will tempt them away from their insular isolation, regardless of what that larger world is made out of, or how it's capitalist or not, right? A non-capitalist larger world that still has, a division of labor and people doing things in different places and specialization and large structures will still tempt them away from their isolation.
Would you not say that there's something niche about capitalism and globalization in the way that it economically makes it so that that person in the short term sees a higher quality of life, but in the long term maybe like lower fertility rates, like you're saying? Like, I think there's something niche about what capitalism kind of functions for, that marks it different from another sphere, like from your argument of, you could replace it with any pervasive sphere.
Well, if you look at the history of the Soviet Union, from 1910 to 1990, they had many local cultures that they assimilated into a larger economy. They just as strongly and severely prevented people from being isolated cultures in that world as in the rest of the capitalist world, because the Soviet Union wanted an integrated society where there was a large specialist division of labor, people would go to work wherever they were best, people would move around, have shared schools. All of those things existed in the Soviet Union, causing exactly the same problem you're pointing to. And if there's any example of a non-capitalist society in our history, it would be that. So that suggests it's not about capitalism, it's about modernity, basically. If you're trying to be modern, you will be trying to get your whole nation to be modern. You will be trying to tempt these isolated communities into merging into the large modern thing you're building, and that's the problem.
Thank you so much.
Hey, so I was thinking about your deep multiculturalism and how you want some global government that enforces a couple of very high-level rules of no war, open trade between these many different cultures, right? And I was thinking, well, maybe you want some more high-level rules to make sure that there isn't one subculture that's doing horrible things to their slaves or something, right? And maybe you want to implement something like Scott Alexander's thing of everyone is able to freely leave any country, right? But how do you prevent this sort of big cultural drift in the big government of people keep adding on things oh, wait, we're letting these humans leave country, but what about animals? What if animals are suffering in these horrible factory fronts? Let those animals leave too. And then you just add on more and more global rules, and now you're back to a monoculture. How do you prevent that?
So.
And wait, sorry, let me add. I think that I didn't know Scott Alexander had that rule about letting people leave, but that's a requirement for nosing too, right?
Well, he's ambiguous about that.
Oh, okay. I thought it was.
He says there would need to be some rules about some degree of freedom to leave, but he also understands that going too far with that basically affects local investment. So yes, it's an issue. So I was alluding, there's a book by a man named Stuntz about the history of American law. At the year 2000, he's a Harvard professor who died soon after. It gives the history of American law as we initially had enormous freedom for each county to have different laws, and then over time these moral crusades forced more and more convergence in law. exactly because of those sorts of, the obvious story is, well, you need a sharp line or it's going to be crossed. My Futarchy proposal does address that in the sense that, if we're just going to do whatever it takes to get to the stars, if speculators think, oh, that's going too far, that's going to degrade it, then they will disapprove, and then it works that way. So, in some sense, that's the advantage of picking a metric and committing to, we want to maximize this metric, because then you will actually get that metric maximized.
But what about like Goodhart's law of like, once you start maximizing for that metric, then you realize that it no longer actually correlates with human values. Right? When we get to the stars, well, why don't we just build a star here? Oh, we just blew up the Earth.
Our world is full of metrics that actually work. So, somebody's told you metrics never work because they always get polluted. I'm sorry, our world is full of working metrics. Look around you. You will find vast numbers of metrics that function to coordinate groups where people would have an incentive to pollute the metric and they still function. So I say it is possible. There's a wonderful book called How to Measure Everything.
I have that book.
Okay. Talks about all the different ways to measure and to make them robust measurements that resist these sorts of attempts to degrade them.
If it's not something vague like liberty, justice, and equality, if it's something that we make pretty concrete, we specify which stars, we specify how many of us have to get there, then what we're really doing is saying that we don't have anything more to learn about what the human good is. That is, this is what it is. And I just think none of us think that. That's why you're going to have a really hard time getting us to pin something like that down, because we don't actually know yet. That's the thing, we're still working on that. If we say liberty, justice, and equality, that's vague enough that it's like we can still be figuring out what liberty, justice, and equality are.
But that's the magic of getting to the stars. When we get to the stars, we have to pick the next thing. And that's when that's the next time to revise and say, okay, what have you learned since then about what you really want, and pick the next goal based on the things you've learned. So it's long steps, but each new step will include the things you've learned about what you want and use that to make the next choice.
Yeah, I guess that just feels very constraining, to be constrained for however many hundred years by the stars thing.
None of the solutions here are good. I have to admit, I'm not very happy with any of the solutions I've mentioned.
You want to say follow-up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm worried that at some point we'll either accidentally end up throwing away everything else's value of going for the stars, or find that going for the stars is impossible, and then we're just stuck on an impossible goal forever.
And I'm afraid our civilization will collapse and die, and very little of what we value will go on to the next civilization.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, I guess my question is, what unique, concrete prediction can you make within the next 5 to 10 years that would essentially prove right or prove wrong your theories about cultural evolution and fertility?
We have a specialty field that studies this stuff. They're already convinced. I'm telling you what they already believe. I'm not making up new things for the world to be convinced by. I'm communicating to you the existing consensus of an existing field that's been around for a while.
So what predictions do they make?
There are, hundreds of papers published every year which are empirical, which are testing various aspects of cultural evolution. It's a rich, long field, and they're way ahead of you in doing empirical testing.
Wait a minute. I feel like I know what some of your predictions are, Robin. So, prediction would be that, say Africa. Africa's still pretty high fertility, at least relative to the rest of the world. They're well above replacement. But as countries within Africa, as they get richer, the fertility is going to drop in those places. That would at least be one prediction, right?
That's a prediction of just the trends, predicting the trends. I'm happy to make that, but that's not actually a prediction of cultural evolution. That's just a prediction of following the trends.
Yeah, I guess my whole point would be to make a unique prediction that is not made on other models of just regular trends, but your specific theory would make, so maybe it would be a good indicator as to whether your theory is going in the right direction and it's hitting all the causal mechanisms.
Right. I'm trying to tell you I don't have a specific different theory from other people. I'm not here with my unique theory about something. I'm trying to tell you what the other specialists in this field already believe.
But what's the prediction that the other specialists would make? That is, how would this is a theory.
So for example, I've asked specialists, so are the Amish just going to replace us? And they say, well, yeah. The Amish will continue to grow, we will continue to decline, and the surprising exane thing of this tiny group coming to displace everyone else will just, every 20 years they will double. Wait 20 years and they will double again. They've done it since 1905. Is that a surprising prediction?
Hello, I'm a big fan of Minds Almost Meeting, so I'm going to attempt to ask a question in the hopes that it will prompt some sort of dialogue between both of you. I was struck earlier by the expert elite sort of explanation or dichotomy. I was probably struck by this because, by coincidence, I spent the first half of my career working roughly in an elite space. I was a Capitol Hill staffer, and then the second half of my career working in roughly an expert space. I currently work in a DC think tank. So I was sort of mapped this onto something that you said in the most recent podcast episode, Agnes, that you're exploring. You're looking at the exploration, exploitation dilemma. And I was sort of wondering, in my mind, it mapped that like experts are very much in this exploration side of the dilemma, and elites are very much in the exploitation side of the dilemma. And neither side really has an incentive to seek a like local optimum, or to seek an optimum between these two endpoints, at least as it relates to like issues of propagating the values in their culture that they currently value. So I want to see if you think that's a coherent mapping, and if you do, if you think that there are plausible mechanisms, either governance mechanisms or different status games or markers to incentivize either side to try to seek some sort of optimum between these two sides.
Could you just repeat, exploit was what and explore was what?
So exploit would be elites. So elites are incentivized to exploit the current system that exists, and they are rewarded when they sort of exploit the system. They get status markers from rising up within the current system, and experts are on this explore side. They are incentivized, at least within like the DC world, to seek for, like, to work towards exploring within their subject level domain very like clear and focused and narrow ways to solve discrete problems, and that this is like more on the, like you were saying, oh, here's a problem and we do have a solution, but like the solution then comes from the side who's on this pole of, we're just really thinking about how to exploit the current system and the reward and spoils of the system as it exists.
I think that there's just going to be plenty of experts who are not very exploratory, like the person who repairs shoes, okay, shoe repair person. That person is an expert in doing something, I know, because nowadays it's really hard. They've mostly gone out of business, and so if you have something wrong with your shoes, you cannot get it fixed. There's no one who has the relevant expertise. And so there's just a lot of like, experts who learned a way of doing something and they know how to do that thing. I guess I think that this is where I feel unsure about this distinction. Robin and I have had one podcast on it where I think we're hoping to do more on it because I'm skeptical about it. I feel like there are sort of elite experts. That is, the think tank people are like, they're a special kind of expert, right? Like they're kind of expert, yeah, that's relatively high up in the totem pole of experts, and those people are exploring. But there's also going to be elites who are exploratory, right? Certain types of politicians or activists are going to be advocating for change and for an exploratory approach. So, I mean, many elites are going to want to rest on their laurels, but some elites are going to be striving to get those laurels by advocating change. So I guess I'm more inclined to think that these two distinctions cut across one another. There is some clumping at certain points, but I don't have a theory of exactly where they're going to clump or where they're going to come apart.
I'd say they're both matters of degree, and some people have substantial elements of both. But my claim with respect to bringing up the whole topic is here to say that when we think about collective exploration, i.e. getting groups of people to back some exploratory venture, I say that's what we need to come from elites. We are not willing to back an exploratory collective venture unless elites back it. That's my key claim. That's a thing to learn about if you want to propose changes to the world. And what you have is expertise. You're going to be frustrated because the world will just nod and listen to your proposal, but they aren't actually going to act on it unless you put together a sufficient coalition of elites for them to feel safe in following your lead, because a collective action needs to be a social action of people doing things together, and they need elites to lead those.
A great example for this is going to be, what's that TV show that we've just watched it about the astronauts, the alternative history in which Russia gets to the
For
moon.
All Mankind.
For All Mankind. Okay, so there's this TV show about in which the space program based an alternate world in which it became a bigger deal than it has in our world. And the point is that this tension about experts versus elites is just throughout the show. There's like the people who work at NASA, the technicians, and they have all these dreams and ideas. But there's basically, at the top, there's this interface with the government. And unless you can get the government people and the politicians on board, they can't, the scientists and the researchers can't get the things they want. So it's like there's this joint or connection point. Go ahead.
We may disagree less than she thinks.
No, I have a lot of thoughts, but I will cede the room to the other folks that are here to not monopolize.
Okay.
Hi. So we've kind of circling around this idea, but I just wanted to maybe put a slightly finer point on it. So you have an evolutionary model of culture, and I think the thing about an evolutionary model of life or my existence as an individual is that it's kind of sad. It takes my life to be just a means to an end, where the end is the proliferation of the species. And if there's anything that gives me hope that my existence is inherently valuable and not just a means to an end, it's probably culture. But you want to define the value of culture in terms of its ability to sort of proliferate itself. And I guess I was wondering, does that kind of make culture a little bit meaningless? Does that not make you personally feel a little less excited about life or human culture or something?
So again, there's two perspectives. There's the inside and the outside. So from the outside, you have this natural selection story of the universe, by DNA selection and cultural evolution, and its new rapid powers, but the ways it can go wrong, and the kind of things you're expected to produce. But then from the inside, you are a member of a culture, and you grew up in a culture, you're inspired by it, you accept its values, and you think your culture is different from all the other ones, because yours is right and all the others are wrong. And then in your culture, it told you what you should admire, what you should hold most valuable, what is the most sacred to you, and you believe that. And so, for example, when we did this last thing on the sacred 2 years ago, maybe, I didn't realize it was 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2 years ago. Basically, most people who study the sacred, the reason they think it's an interesting concept is because they think there is something that's actually sacred. And it might be God or something else or art, and that's the reason why the concept matters to them, and they're interested in studying it only because they want to understand why there is this actual sacred thing. Whereas social scientists studying the sacred, we say there seems to be this human tendency to treat some things as sacred, and we can understand why that is and how it functions and how it differs across society, but then we're not saying there is a sacred thing, we're just saying there's this habit to treat some things as sacred. You can see again an inside versus outside view of the sacred. From you who find something as actually sacred, it's not going to work for you to think, oh, my society happened to pick this as sacred so that we could bind together in some social ways. No, from my point of view, there is the sacred tree. That tree is a sacred tree. It's different from the other trees in a way that only me and the people who get it can see, and that's really why we're bound together. And it's not that there's just this way that sacredness evolved as a habit. There is the sacred tree, and that's how you want to feel about your culture too, right? No, my culture says that equality is good and that inclusion is good, and they really are good. And I don't care if cultural evolution doesn't recognize that, because I can see it myself, and that's the inside view of culture. And honestly, most high quality public intellectual discussions in our world are people making those inside arguments about culture, about which way we should go together, what we should all value most. It's passionate, it's powerful, it motivates people, and that's how cultures work inside. And I guess this is the fundamental problem with being an intellectual. You have to be able to handle these 2 points of view. The outside view of what kind of universe you're in and how it works, and the inside view of you're a creature who cares about stuff. And even though you know where that caring came from in some sense, you can still care about it.
So I just don't agree that the outside view is this evolutionary or scientific view. That is, just like I don't agree that like the outside view would somehow say that the ferns are doing better in some sense than the dinosaurs did. And I think like one way to think about it is, you can think about stuff that you do in your life in order to keep existing. So like you eat, say, in order to keep existing. And then there's stuff in your life where it's your reason for existing, right? So you want to preserve your life, but there's a reason you want to preserve your life, because there's stuff you want to achieve with your life. And I think that, I think your life wouldn't be worth much if you would want to continue it under all circumstances. That is, if you want to keep living no matter what, that is, no matter how evil you have to be in order to keep living, if you would always choose to keep living rather than to do super evil, terrible stuff, then you're in effect saying your life really isn't worth anything. You're just a slave, right, to your mere biological existence. And the very thought, my life is worth something, is the thought. There are circumstances under which it would be better not to exist. And I guess I agree with you, and I think the same thing is true about culture. I think that, you know, we have a culture, we think it's valuable because of things like liberty, justice, and equality. Those what give our culture value. Should our culture continue? Well, it depends. I mean, it depends whether it has a reason to continue. That is, there are things it might need to do in order to continue. So there are things we have reason to do given that we want to continue, but then there's the question, should we continue or not? And I guess my view is, the question, should we continue or not? The question, is our culture worth something or not? Is the furthest outside view you have. It's like the objective truth about the value of your culture. You could, you know, wonder whether we can ask that question. You could think we're always biased in answering it. But I think people have answered it in the negative about their own lives. They have said, I will sacrifice my life for something because this thing is worth more than my life. And so I don't see why we couldn't say, well, we should sacrifice our cultures rather than let our culture devolve into something.
And then some of us wonder how it is that atoms in an empty universe collected into creatures like yourself who have these passionate values. We study the causal process that produced a creature like you, and we learn about biological evolution and cultural evolution. And we say our best theory of how it is that you came to these values is a theory that makes these values kind of random.
Well, I mean, from the genetic story about how I acquired my values, you just don't get any information about why they're valuable and which ones are worth preserving and what you should do and what would be maladaptive or not, right? So I just want to grant any kind of causal story you're going to tell, but the question, like, you know, is low fertility maladaptive, i.e. should we try to avoid it? Is all the things that ChatGPT thinks are maladaptive, is it right or wrong about what's maladaptive? Those are not questions about what did we evolve to value. They're questions about what, as a matter of fact, ought we to value? What's worth pursuing?
And when you ask yourself what we ought to value and you come to an answer, that answer was caused by a universe with a long history of direct, specific physical processes that make the structure of your brain and the way it reasons and the premises it has,
Absolutely.
the things you heard about, causing you to have that answer to that question. So
the same is true for all of our understanding of physics, for our understanding of math, all of that. The way that my brain works is there's causal stuff that explains why I think 2 + 2 is 4. It's still 4.
But if I can show you how your brain came to this conclusion through processes that couldn't possibly have known the answer to this question about, then the question is, how do you think you came to this answer? Where did that come from?
I'm not sure I care if I can prove that 2 + 2 is 4, because then I know it's the right answer, regardless of how I got there.
Your brain is just telling you, I know the answer and I'm sure, and I'm saying, let's look at where your brain came from to be the sort that would tell you it was sure of this thing it knew the answer to. If you look at that process and the process didn't know the answer, then maybe you shouldn't trust this brain that tells you it knows the answer.
I mean, if I was going to listen to your argument, I'd have to trust my powers of listening to arguments, including this one, right?
Yes.
And I kind of think if I don't trust that 2 + 2 is 4, then we're already off that of me
We're not
trusting
talking
any
2 plus 2
argument
is
you ever
4.
give. Well, but that's just an example.
You know equality is good. How do you
Yes.
know that? Not the same way you know 2 plus 2 is 4.
No, I mean, it's an elaborate argument, and I give it in my book that's coming out in January, by the way. You can all read it.
Everybody buy it.
I don't think it's obvious. I think you have to explain it. It's hard to understand, but I don't think it's impossible.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah. If you like this, you'll love our podcast.
So I think my question is sort of one that Agnes raised about like whether low fertility is maladaptive. And so you seem very focused on fertility and the like low fertility problem. And I guess I was one of the people that thought this wasn't so much of a problem. And I'm sort of still not convinced. And it's sort of, I guess it seems like it maybe is a problem for the survival of the human race, but it's not really a problem for the survival of
Talking fast and quiet, so just
sorry.
slower and louder.
Yeah, so it seems like that low fertility is maybe a problem for the survival of the human race, but not so much a problem for the survival of a particular culture, as long as there are enough people out there to proselytize to, or conquer, or be awesome and try to get them to emulate. And maybe you're better off spending time indoors and your child rearing, being awesome instead. And I guess I want to hear an argument for why fertility is so important.
So the whole world largely is falling in fertility, except for these few very distinctive insular fertile subcultures. So the Roman Empire could, for example, have low internal fertility and go conquer more Goths and bring them into the Roman Empire, and then the Roman Empire would keep growing because they would go conquer outsiders. We don't have any outsiders to conquer anymore. We're not into conquering anyway. So
According to you, in a short 1 billion years, we're going to meet aliens, right?
the Amish will. And you will ask to the degree you've influenced whatever they become, and then or whatever next civilization they influenced 1,000 times iterated for the next billion years.
So if there were infinitely many people, would you still have, like, the infinitely many important people, would you still have this, like, focus on producing more of your own people versus trying to convince other people to join you?
Well, there are different approaches to infinity. In some of them, there is no way to add to infinity, and in others there are. So if I can add to infinity, then evolution will want more of it. If infinity is the max, then of course it can't.
I'm going to answer a little on Robin's behalf too, is that Robin is someone who thinks that we're going to have AI descendants, and that we can have like copies of our brains and those to be descendants. So he's not attached to the idea of biological descendants. He's probably less attached to the idea that anyone else.
Probably still a finite number of those. Honestly, the infinity thing's not really going to be an option.
Thank you both for coming. Robin, I have a question, something we touched on earlier today. Like you, I independently arrived at the conclusion that we need more cults, and would like to start my own today. But it seems that most
Have you filled out the right form? I believe there are some proper forms to be filled out to apply to be a cult. It should not be authoritative approval for that.
I'm behind on the paperwork. But it seems that most of the successful cults rely on believing compelling stories that to me don't seem to be true. Like, I don't believe the main stories from Islam or Christianity or Judaism. So my question is three-part. Do you think, and as somebody who you said lived through briefly through a cult, so you might have expert opinion, do you think those stories are required, like magical thinking or something along those lines? More, what do you think are the successful traits of a cult, or what's required? And would either of you be interested in being part of the brain trust of that cult?
Most cults don't have a board of advisors. I'm sorry, if you're going to do the board of advisors, you're already losing right here from the start.
Not that you know about, you guys can see it.
Look, it's really hard to create a cult that lasts and grows and is insular. It's crazy hard. If you're taking things off the table right from the start, you're just going to lose. I'm sorry. You should not be putting anything off the table, any options at all to try to make your cult. Go for everything you possibly could draw to make it work. It's really hard. And crazy beliefs are definitely one of the most common elements of cults, so do not put that off the table.
It's not the answer I wanted. But
Do you want to win or don't you?
okay, I'm going to start surveying some cults. Thank you.
Well, let us know how it goes.
Okay, well.
Great, thank you so much for being here today. You claim that cultural evolution is the self-correcting mechanism necessary for, or at least very strongly conducive to, the flourishing of human civilization. If I interpret you correctly, you even claim that absent cultural evolution, human civilization risks dysfunction and potentially oblivion. I want to push back slightly on your argument and ask you to provide some additional justification. So one reason you gave for a claim was that cultural evolution is precisely one of those reasons which explain why humans are more effective or more successful than animals. I think that it's certainly a very justifiable claim that culture sets humans apart from other animals. For example, because it enables us to cooperate in a manner that is conducive to having more free time, besides self-sustaining and such, to develop civilizations and to pursue put more effort into science and other human pursuits. But I don't see why that very intuitive reason in favor of that reason warrants your claim that cultural evolution per se, instead of just culture, promotes human flourishing. That's the first part of my question. I'll just leave it there for a moment.
So, by flourishing, I mean not dying.
Okay.
As opposed to other concepts of flourishing, which could be more demanding.
Okay.
The story is just, cultural evolution is the story of which cultures survive and which go away, and how that happens. So, cultural evolution is not just the set of accumulated culture you have at any one moment, it's the process that created that accumulation that will continue to add to it, and that will allow your accumulated culture to change as your world changes. That's the process of cultural evolution. So if you just suddenly stopped cultural evolution and just had your inherited culture, then unfortunately it would slowly decay over time and become less relevant to the new world you're in, and you would be less functional because you would no longer be continuing to evolve the culture.
I see, but I think one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but the title of the talk is, are we homogenizing ourselves into oblivion? And I'm referring to, I suppose, diversity among different cultures that is necessary for the lack of oblivion. But I don't see why is it not true that within one culture, one can adapt and change without there being cultural diversity at any given moment, which I think that's one of the things you're arguing.
So think of these two levels. So think of fishing.
Sure.
If you look around and you say, I want to fish well, and you see other people fishing, and some of them catch a lot more fish, you might say, I'm going to copy the people who catch more fish, and then I'll be able to get more fish too. And that's a way cultural evolution works well when you can see the thing you want, and then see who produced the thing you want and just copy them. So that kind of cultural evolution is really healthy and works great, and it can work fine within a culture and you don't need other cultures. But that's because you know this outcome you want and you can see where it happened and who to attribute it to. But cultural evolution also has these other parts where we copy what people do when we don't know why, we don't know what the purpose of it is or in what way they are actually more successful. We just have this habit of copying the high status people. And that's the part that can go much more easily wrong when we, for example, copy whoever the richest people are. They have few kids so their kids could be richer, then we all have few kids because we're copying that. So the key thing that can go wrong is when we just generically copy high status people's behavior without knowing very much why it's better. And that's the thing that can just go badly wrong within one culture because we keep changing these values about who counts as higher status and what the indicators are and what our norms are and things like that. And so we just keep changing these values. It's not like the fishing case where we have this metric, we're sure we want more fish. Like if we weren't sure what counted as a fish or how big they were, things like that, then this copying fishing thing wouldn't go so well, right? this person could have 5 medium-sized fish and that one would have 50 small fish, and we're not sure which one's better, so now cultural evolution doesn't work so well, right? But we have, the kilograms of fish metric or something to say who has the more fish you care about, well, that can work well. So, but cultural evolution works badly when we don't have a metric like that. We know what we want, and we're just copying high-status people's behavior. That's within a culture, it can just go badly wrong.
I see. Okay, so the second part of my question. So I agree with you that I do find that reasoning very, very plausible, but enough for you to engage with some other counter arguments. So I have 2 here, and if you don't like them, I'll just ask you to consider the counter argument that you find most convincing. But I have 2 suggestions. You can come up with a different one. So the first one would be that, at least in my knowledge of history, in the 19th century, some states actually actively pushed for homogenization of different cultures within their national boundaries. For example, integrating peasants into the nation, precisely to promote modernization. The second would be one of the great hallmarks we consider one of the great metric of civilizational flourishing is return is science, the success of science. That's one of the reasons why we consider ancient Greece to be such a successful civilization. And this is just a suggestion, but I'd love to engage with it. So arguably, the success of modern science is greatly promoted by international cooperation of scientists, and one could argue that international cooperation is promoted not per se by cultural variety, but a certain level of homogeneity, such that the different scientists are not bored by the fundamental differences in culture, but instead are sufficiently comfortable with other people's culture, such that they can cooperate.
So,
sorry, before you answer, Robin, I'm just going to ask you, try to be efficient. I want to get through these last 2 questions,
okay.
And we only have a few minutes left. So.
All right.
Yeah.
Or give your favorite counter.
In the paper, again, I discussed these 2 levels of selection, 2 levels of innovation. So on the corporation, there's within a corporation, there's between corporations. And for species, there's within a species, and between species. What you're pointing to is that when you have larger species or larger corporations, it has more internal innovation, more ways that things can work out better internally because there's a larger thing to share within. But that produces less between innovation or selection because you have more within. So you're seeing the ways in which having larger shared cultures allows more within culture innovation and wealth, etc. And it all looks great until you consider the between. We're having a lot less between culture selection, just like smaller species actually are better for biological evolution overall. Even though innovation within a smaller species is less, innovation between smaller species is more, and that matters more. So that's a quick answer, and look at the essay for more on that.
Okay, I will. Thank you so much.
Hello, Dr. Hanson. I have like a 2-part question, and the first question is, you go on about like cultures having like life cycles, like a living person, and you mentioned other people referring to this in the past. Would you say that Oswald Spengler's like book and his like writings about the idea that Western civilization is in the fall or winter, and that it will be replaced by a new civilization might have some like merit to it? Because he goes into like detail and he talks about how like the mating patterns change in modern Western culture. They're just like quote from The Decline of the West, I think, where he talks about how like instead of just approaching a woman and seeing her as the mother of your like children, and that's her only purpose. He goes on about modern relationships being like a partnership, and the woman is the man's life mate, and this is a sign that the culture is like shifting. So would you say there's also some sort of Spenglerian civilization life cycle aspect to this? And then 2 is, you mentioned the like Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union as an example of homogenizing culture, but the Soviet Union did also subsidize and fund cultural self-determination for every like ethnic group within the USSR. Like they hired people to write down the like languages of small groups and like teach people in that like region their own language. And even with that, the birth rates of the Soviet Union didn't really hit the like total like shitter until the USSR collapsed, and there were still high birth rate ethnic groups within the USSR, even if part of that might have been slanted by an urban-rural gap. And also China, but that's all. Thank you.
You had two questions. The second one I remember is the USSR, and I just think it's objectively true that there was homogenization that happened.
Wait, can I add something there? So, I don't know if you remember, Robin, but in this book that we both read, Peasants into Frenchmen, when basically Paris colonized France at the end of the 19th century and, took all these different peasant cultures and assimilated them to basically Parisian culture, they did the same thing. So they hired all these ethnographers, and for the first time they started to study all these different peasant cultures. Nobody had been interested in them before, so it may be there's actually a correlation between, in some sense, the promotion in some way of the local culture and the homogenization.
And I just lost track of your first question.
Spengler, yeah.
So there's a
cycle of history.
There's a vast literature on people with stories of history, and they've all got different favorite hobby horses about why we're in decline. And everybody, basically, if you have a thing you don't like, you want to tie up to a story of how the Roman Empire felt because of that thing. So you just have to hold yourself to a higher. Obviously, if I'm going to tell a cyclical story, I am at some level similar to other people with a cyclical story, but it's not necessarily going to be the same story.
Right.
I'm going to have to go read the details, and I haven't read the details of that. I've read some cyclical things, but not that particular.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, last question.
I have a question. So I feel like when I see the world, I see there are many people that are very accepting of idiosyncrasies. I feel like there are large parts of our culture that are very accepting of being different, and there are people that obviously seek out idiosyncrasies. I feel like I see this even among the elite. For example, there's like a pronatal movement that I believe is pretty popular among the elite.
So what movement? Sorry, pronatal.
Specifically, I guess, talking about declining fertility rates. So I feel like I see this world where there are large parts of culture that select for idiosyncrasy and evolve different subcultures. And I guess I see a world where I feel like there is a lot of signs of cultural evolution. So I guess my question is just why don't I seem to see that the world is becoming less culturally evolved and diverse?
When you agree with the dominant culture, you don't notice how the differences from that are less common. So let's take some of these cultural changes that have happened over the last, my lifetime, basically. So one of them is more attention to children, right? Over time, I can see this with my child, with my grandchild. We have paid more attention to children as we're raising them. There's more of a standard of just being there for more hours, more constantly paying attention to them, more interacting with them. If you watch, say, movies from the 1930s of parents and children, the parents are hardly paying any attention to the children. That's fine for them, but we would find it horrifying. But this isn't just a habit some of us have, it's a norm in that those who deviate get punished. That is, if you have a dispute and you divorce your wife and she can show that you haven't spent so much time with your kid, then you won't get custody of the kid. And even parents who let their kids walk home from school by themselves are, taken to social services because they aren't paying enough attention to the kids. We've embodied in law and custom and norms a lot of the shared values that have changed, and that's why they are part of culture, because it's hard to deviate. Not impossible, but you pay penalties for deviating. Those are the things that we share as a culture, are the things that people pay substantial penalties for deviating from the consensus on. Another thing there was the switch from, say, cornerstone to capstone marriage, and again, if you want to deviate from that, you're allowed to, but you will pay costs. It'll be harder to find a partner if you want to have a cornerstone marriage instead of a capstone marriage.
I'm sorry, can I just zone in on the first example? So I feel like I've been told that this is a shift that occurred over the years. However, I feel like I've also seen people counter against this shift, that they feel like the previous generation was overblown in how dangerous they thought letting kids walk home alone is, and that a lot of people like consciously say, I'm going to let my children play outside more because I don't believe that this is actually a real risk, and I think that the benefits outweigh the risk. And I feel like for a lot of these examples, I feel like I can see, I don't know, there might be a period where these ideas are dominant, but then it feels like for a lot of these examples, inevitably there's counter shift, and there's like, there are people that push back against these, and I think I see this as a sign of cultural evolution.
Let's take one of the strongest trends, which is longer career paths. That's what you guys are doing. This is a college, and most of you are college students. And there are people who deviate. There are people who don't go to college. And you know what? Most of them suffer substantially compared to you. They make half your salary. They're illegally allowed to do it. But nevertheless, the culture is punishing them by comparison to you who are following culture's dictates to have many years of education. So on all of these things where I say culture is pushing one way, it's not like it's illegal to do it another way, although sometimes it is, but you pay substantial penalties, which is why other people keep